Hey everybody, Maverick Christian here. In this episode, I'm going to comment on PineCreek's critique on one of my videos and a bit about what happened afterwards. Late November 2020, I found out that PineCreek was going to do a live stream where he critiques one of my videos, and when I showed up on the chat there, PineCreek invited me to come on his live stream and I accepted. I found out about the live stream shortly before PineCreek critiqued my video because my Maverick sense was tingling.
You sure you didn't find out about it because out of your own insecurity you searched for yourself on YouTube and the live stream appeared on the search results?
What kind of pathetic loser do you take me for? Part 1, Background. PineCreek discovered me on YouTube possibly in the same month he aired his livestream.
And then this guy, I got to play this guy because his name is Maverick Christian. I don't think I've ever talked to him or about him before ever, but he has the name Maverick as an adjective to the word Christian. So I have to, I consider myself a maverick. It's like, if you want me to do something, get everybody to do the opposite, and then I'll probably do that one thing. It's just in my nature to be a contrarian. And plus, I just like, look at him. Like, look at the hair, look at the eyebrows, look at the beard, nicely trimmed, nice glasses, bright eyes. It's like he's out to play.
Well, it's about time a fellow content creator complimented me on my trimmed beard and lovely bright eyes. PineCreek will later critique my vlog episode 6 Why Some People Are Atheists video on his livestream. I won't go over the entire vlog episode he critiqued, but I'll introduce the gist of some parts, first by defining what I mean by morality since that ends up being pretty important.
Moral semantics is about how we define moral terminology. Moral obligations have an ought component. For example, an action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not to do it. But it's important to understand the type of ought we're using here. There's the descriptive ought, which is that type of ought that is reducible to something purely descriptive. That is, a descriptive ought is entirely descriptive in nature. An example would be someone saying, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. In contrast, a prescriptive ought is that type of ought that is not a descriptive ought. It prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive. An example would be someone saying you should not torture infants just for fun. The moral ought is a prescriptive ought. It is false that the moral ought has no properties besides purely descriptive ones. For example, an action is morally obligatory for someone only if they prescriptively ought to do it. As a warning, some non-theists have moral semantics where moral obligations are entirely descriptive. It might sound weird, but it does happen sometimes.
To oversimplify and summarize, what this prescriptive ought moral semantics lead to is that morality is not natural. Moral property like moral wrongness, for example, isn't a physical property, it's invisible and empirically undetectable. While in a theistic worldview it makes perfect sense that moral right and wrong would exist, many theists and atheists agree that, given atheism, it's unlikely that moral wrongness exists. Consequently, many atheists deny the existence of morality, and so some atheists don't see that anything is morally wrong, not even torturing infants just for fun. Which leads me to this version of the moral argument I mentioned in the video.
Premise 1. If God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. Premise 2. Some things are morally wrong, like torturing infants just for fun. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists.
Due to a theorem of mathematics and propositional logic, given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist, entails probably if atheism is true, then nothing is morally wrong. You can find a proof of that theorem on my blog. The upshot is that if an atheist believes that given God's non-existence it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists, they are rationally obligated to accept the first premise as at least probably true. One of the reasons I'm a theist is that I think both premises of this argument are true. By my lights, it doesn't seem reasonable to disbelieve that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. And I think that, given atheism, it's unlikely that morality exists. A lot of atheists agree with me that, given atheism, morality probably doesn't exist, and consequently, such atheists reject morality's existence, which brings me to these two contrasting worldviews.
Many people intuitively sense the non-natural realm. Not necessarily with God directly, there's also morality, which is non-natural. Just as we intuitively sense the external world being real, many intuitively sense there's something morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. Some people apparently don't sense it. They apparently don't sense there's something morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. I say apparently because it's not always clear whether they do have this sense that there's something wrong with torturing infants, but they ignore it because it doesn't fit their narrative of reality, or they just don't have that sense of morality at all. Now here's an important disclaimer. Moral nihilists, those who don't believe anything is morally wrong, can be nice people, can be as opposed to torture as much as the next person. But if they were to be consistent, they would have to admit that they think their intense dislike of such torture is just a matter of taste and there's nothing really wrong with it. Because the moment they do believe people shouldn't torture infants, they're believing in morality. So here's at least a partial explanation of why some people are theists and some people are atheists. And that reason is this. It might just boil down to people having different intuitive perceptions.
Part 2, PineCreek Critiques. Critiquing my video, he uses a bit of a red herring. I talk more about red herrings in vlog episode 8, but to recap, a red herring is something that misleads or distracts, and a red herring fallacy, or ignoratio elenchi, is a fallacy of supposing a point proved or refuted by establishing something not at issue. Some red herring fallacies argue for a point closely related to the topic at hand to have a greater chance of hoodwinking the audience. With that in mind, watch this clip.
The real question, though, is why ought someone follow a prescriptive ought? Going meta here. So, for example, you should not torture infants just for fun. Why not? Why shouldn't I torture infants just for fun? Well, because you shouldn't. Well, why not? Well, because there's a standard that prescribes that you ought not. Well, why should I follow that standard, that prescriptive standard? This is a question I ask Christians a lot, is why ought anyone obey God? And funny enough, once you start asking those types of questions, why ought anyone obey God? You're going to end up going back up here to the descriptive oughts. Like, and if you don't believe me, just try it. So if you're a Christian listening, why ought I obey God? For what's the first thing that pops in your head? Now, depending on the type of Christian you are, the first thing that pops into some Christians' head is, because if you don't, you're going to burn in hell forever.
This is a good opportunity to deploy a simple red herring analysis I talked about in vlog episode 8.
Determine the position being opposed, determine the objection to the position, determine whether the objection attacks the position. Does the objection attack the truth or justification of the position? Is there a gap between what is claimed and what is being argued for?
In this case, PineCreek seems to claim that on the Christian view, whereby avoiding hell is a reason to obey God, such a theistic moral ought is actually a descriptive ought. But there's a gap between what is being claimed and what is being shown. Remember that descriptive oughts are purely descriptive. They have only descriptive characteristics. Suppose a Christian says that a practical reason to obey God is to avoid hell. At best, that shows that this theistic moral ought has a descriptive characteristic. It doesn't show that this theistic moral ought has only descriptive characteristics. So there's a bit of a gap between what is claimed and what is shown. PineCreek argues for a point closely related to the actual topic, but not the actual claim. He doesn't actually establish that we ought to obey God as a descriptive ought on this Christian view. Kind of address this later when I appear on the live stream.
And I think I even got you to agree that your prescription ends up being a description. Because you remember when I said, why ought you obey God? Or how does God help you decide what behavior? You went to the descriptive, because if your goal is not to go to, you didn't say hell, but go to hell, or if you want to not be punished, or if you want to be rewarded, that there's consequences for your actions. If you don't want bad consequences and you want good consequences, that becomes a descriptive, not a prescriptive. And in my opinion, prescriptive is like worthless.
But remember how I defined morality? I said that morality prescribes in a way without being purely descriptive. Now, that doesn't mean I can't have practical reasons to do what I prescriptively ought to do.
Yeah.
A straw man is a mischaracterization of someone's position, especially if the position is misrepresented in a way that makes it easier to attack. With that in mind,
very roughly, an action is morally wrong for someone if we prescriptively ought not to do it, with this prescriptive ought being supremely authoritative. Okay, now I'm going to paraphrase that. You tell me if I'm right or wrong. What I think you're saying here is that what is morally right or wrong is defined by God's nature, by definition. So you see an action. If that action comports to the nature of God, then it's morally right. If it goes against the nature of God, what he desires, what he wants, what he wills, what he commands, what he decrees, all that great stuff that flows out of his nature, if it goes against that, then it's morally wrong. Am I steel manning you, or am I straw manning you? Am I close?
no. It's remarkable how big the gap is between my actual definition and the straw man definition immediately after having seen my actual definition. For frack's sake, my actual definition didn't even mention God. It's as if you were hallucinating or something. This reinforces my point in vlog episode 9 where I explain how even flagrant straw men can be unintentional. I don't think PineCreek was deliberately distorting my position, in part because I was there to correct him and he accepted my correction in that very live stream.
Okay, you're Maverick Christian saying I'm not defining morality in terms of God. Okay, that's good. Let's go on then.
Not to mention, he showed my actual definition on screen right before the actual straw man. However, remember when he learned that I don't define morality in terms of God? A few minutes after that.
You have chosen a standard. That standard is the nature of God, and that's how you define morality.
No, I didn't. I had to tell him again that wasn't my position.
Maverick Christian in the live stream chat says, no, I don't define morality in terms of God. Okay.
And again, I don't think this factual misrepresentation was deliberate because he showed and accepted my correction again, and this does illustrate that even when someone reiterates a straw man after having been corrected, doesn't mean they're dishonest. It could be they're just not thinking rationally. Although it may be tempting to assume that atheists are lying when they misrepresent the facts this badly, consider what would have happened if this PineCreek situation unfolded a little differently. Suppose he read my definition on my blog or something, and then he misrepresented it like he did in this video. One might think he was lying. Suppose I corrected him, and the next day he misrepresented my position again. One might think this.
He has to be lying. Could a person be so befuddled in their thinking that they repeat the same factual misrepresentation so soon after being corrected on it?
Yes, atheists can be amazingly irrational people. Atheists almost have a sort of de facto PR campaign of being rational, but it's kind of baloney. Atheists can be just as irrational as a religious fanatic to the point of effectively hallucinating what someone didn't say. Severe irrationality isn't limited to atheists, by the way. The same can occur for the religious and political left and the political right. So remember Hanlon's razor in that people can make amazingly stupid mistakes in emotionally charged arenas like religion and politics. For more on that, see vlog episode 9.
On atheism, moral wrongness is very strange when you think about it. It's invisible, non-physical, and empirically undetectable.
I disagree with that. Again, it depends on how you define morality, right? But if I see someone do something like stab them with a knife, that's not invisible. That's not non-physical. That is indeed empirically detectable.
This is one reason why I wanted to converse with PineCreek on this livestream, because he didn't seem to understand the position he was attacking. When I appeared on this livestream later on, I tried to clear up the confusion.
Let's see. I think there might have confusion. So this is why in some videos I explain what I mean when I say moral wrongness is empirically undetectable. So I think it didn't quite capture that part. So here's a thought experiment. Imagine a moral realist who does believe in morality and a moral nihilist who does not believe in morality. Both see some jerk kick a dog just for fun. The dog whimpers in pain and runs away. Now, the moral nihilist says, well, I don't think moral wrongness is associated with that action. And moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is associated with that action. There's no empirical way to determine between the two views. They both agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts involved. All the observable facts are the same. They're empirically indistinguishable from each other. And that's what I mean when I say moral wrongness is empirically undetectable.
In one context, a tautology is a repetition of an idea or phrase. One example PineCreek gave in the livestream is, if the dog is red, then the dog is red. With that in mind,
many atheists agree with me that this prescriptive ought morality probably doesn't exist if atheism is true, not on pain of inconsistency.
Yeah, and even if we take God out of this picture and use supreme, invisible, non-tangible existence, but I don't want to use the word God. What word would I use to describe that? Let's just say intangible entity. How's that? If an intangible entity does not exist, then nothing is based on that intangible entity wrong. That's just science. That's just what I did this with William Lane Craig on a video a long time ago. And to me, this really sounds like a tautology.
Sure, if you severely modify the actual meaning of the first premise to be a tautology, like changing morally wrong to mean intangible entity wrong or something like that, it's a tautology, but then you're no longer talking about the actual premise. It sounds like you just might be misconstruing my position, redefining morally wrong, and perhaps God to mean something different from how I meant it.
To two contrasting worldviews. Many people intuitively sense the non-natural realm. Not necessarily with God directly, there's also morality, which is non-natural. Just as we intuitively sense these...
Yeah, I would disagree that morality is non-natural.
He never addresses the argument I mentioned in my video that it is non-natural. Indeed, this is what he said about 13 minutes earlier in his livestream.
Where this leads to is that moral properties of prescriptive oughtness, like moral wrongness, are non-natural. That is, they're not part of the natural physical world. This can be demonstrated fairly rigorously with mathematics and symbolic logic.
Yeah, I'm not going to push back on that. I'll even grant that to you.
Well, apparently that didn't last long. Though if I were to be really super charitable, maybe he was thinking that if you define morality differently than I did, you could come up with a different definition of morality that is purely descriptive and not non-natural. But the problem with that is he wouldn't be disagreeing with what I'm actually saying here, because in this context, I'm using the not purely descriptive definition of morality when I say that morality is not natural.
I say apparently because it's not always clear whether they do have the sense that there's something wrong with torturing infants, but they ignore it because it doesn't fit their narrative of reality, or they just don't have that sense of morality at all. Now here's an important...
Yeah, some people don't have that sense of morality, some psychopaths.
Sounds like he might not have understood what I was saying. I wasn't talking about psychopaths who incidentally can still believe that moral right and wrong exist. I was talking about moral nihilists who need not be psychopaths at all. Again, the problem with moral nihilists is not that they're bad people. The problem with moral nihilism is that it's not a reasonable belief. It is not reasonable to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. Part 3, coming on the show, discussing morality. For the most part, he was pretty respectful, at least while I was on the show. After the show, well, there was this. I don't know why he put philosopher in scare quotes. I never said I was a philosopher. Indeed, during that live stream, I called myself a philosophy Padawan. As of this recording, I'm just a philosophy student. I've only published one paper, and while I know more philosophy than the average person, I have a long way to go.
Well, why ought I follow the prescriptive idea of morality from God?
Why ought we obey God? The question is actually a bit ambiguous. Interpreted one way, the question is asking why it is that God's commands have this ought to be obeyed quality to them. One possibility is that God doesn't ground morality himself, but he knows what's moral and passes on this information through divine commands. Another possibility, the one I accept and gave on the show, is that God himself is the source of moral obligation and has this ought to be obeyed quality as an essential property, and there is no further explanation why he has this property beyond it being metaphysically necessary. So given that this type of God exists, one who has this ought to be obeyed property essentially, it follows logically and inescapably that we ought to obey him, if this God exists. Another way to interpret the question, though, is what is a motivating practical reason for me to obey God's commands? And if what one is really asking for with this question is some motivation that would interest oneself, then one could appeal to self-interest reasons like avoiding divine punishment. But neither interpretation of the question really seems to amount to much as far as the moral argument is concerned. The answers don't do anything to undercut the truth or justification of any premise of the argument. So where was he going with this? Remember that on one interpretation of the question, it's asking for a practical and motivating reason to obey God. And one such possible reason is to avoid divine punishment. Now think back to what PineCreek said earlier about if avoiding hell is a reason to obey God. Well, then the moral ought is a descriptive ought. So he concluded, but that didn't logically follow at all, and yet that seemed to be what PineCreek was thinking. Regarding this moral argument, it would seem that PineCreek believes the second premise is probably false, but he had some difficulty recognizing it.
That's why I think the moral argument is interesting and not a question begging, because an atheist can believe the second premise on the definition of morality that I used. But an atheist could also be with the first premise. And so atheists don't necessarily agree which premise is false. Of course, one of the premises has to be false, and they can't both be false. And so it's not really surprising that some had the intuition that I do. It's like, okay, it is true that the first premise is true. It's very likely true. But it also seems to me that the second premise is true either. There's something wrong with torturing infants just for fun. And by my lights, and these are my intuitive perceptions, it doesn't seem reasonable to me to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing an infant just for fun. That just seems obvious to me.
Yeah, and to me too. And I think, but we just disagree.
Well, not to you, because you don't agree with this. You don't agree with the second premise on the moral semantics I was using, right?
No, it's just the just for fun part is what makes it wrong.
So do you believe in the type of morality I described in my video, the type of moral ought that prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive?
I think probably not. I think, as I said earlier, that...
Well, then you're a moral nihilist. You reject that second premise.
Part of the problem seemed to be he was slipping back to that moral semantics where moral obligations are entirely descriptive rather than using the normal prescriptive sense of morality. If you're a theist dialoguing with an atheist on the moral argument, I recommend being careful about making your terms clear. Some atheists are what I call stealth moral nihilists, in that they claim to believe in morality when they really don't believe in morality, possibly because they're redefining morality to be purely descriptive.
That's part of the point of the video is to kind of explain why some people are atheists and why some people are not. So a lot of atheists are like you and I in that they agree the first premise is true. And some people, for whatever reason, don't see the second premise being true. They don't see that there's anything morally wrong. They don't believe in that not entirely descriptive sort of morality. For whatever reason. I was thinking of doing another YouTube video about are atheists self-deceived.
Yeah.
about that. And
I know we disagree on this, but to me, the first premise, actually, the whole syllogism is just silly because you're saying if God does not exist, then 99.9%, you mean it's logically possible morality doesn't exist. It's like, okay.
It is interesting he thinks the argument is silly when he accepts the first premise because, in a way, the first premise is the key premise. That second premise, that some things are morally wrong, like torturing infants just for fun, that's an extremely common belief. Even a lot of non-theists accept this. Now, if non-theists who agree with the second premise then also see that the first premise is true, well, the non-theist is in an interesting position because the conclusion logically and inescapably follows from the two premises. Part 4, discussing the resurrection. The week I was on PineCreek, I had about 3 different people wanting me to defend the resurrection, like in a debate, and it's not something I'm that interested in part because I can understand how someone would disbelieve in the resurrection of Jesus. As I explained in vlog episode 1, one of the reasons I debate with atheists is because I'm honestly curious how they think. I can understand how someone would disbelieve in the resurrection, but I understand less how one could reasonably deny the first premise of this moral argument being at least probably true. I think the evidence for the resurrection, well, decent, isn't overwhelming. Like if I were a deist, someone who believed in God but didn't believe in any of the revealed religions, I'd say that if this were an ordinary type event, the evidence for the resurrection is good enough to say that the event probably happened, but this isn't an ordinary type of event. It's an extraordinary event, and that requires extraordinary evidence. So while the evidence for the resurrection it's good, but it's not good enough. That's what I would argue if I were a deist, and I think that's a rationally defensible position. One thing that might help understand that deist-like position is to imagine similar historical evidence for another extraordinary claim, like someone flying through the air unaided like Superman. That's roughly what PineCreek's The Flying Man thing is about. In this fictional scenario, an ancestor of his could reportedly fly through the air unaided with the historical evidence for it being similar to the resurrection. Would you believe in the flying man? Would the evidence convince you? My position on the livestream was that I might not disbelieve it, but I'm not sure that I'd believe it either. So why do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Well, no doubt there are multiple factors why it seems intuitively plausible to me. There's the historical evidence that Gary Habermas and William Lane Craig talked about, like the disciples having experiences of Jesus after he died and so forth. I'll leave a link to the William Lane Craig debate on that description below if you're interested in the details and how the other side might respond to the evidence. But there are also theological reasons that play a role, certain theological background beliefs I'd have even if I weren't a Christian. These include 1. God exists. 2. I have sinned against God, and thus if there is such a thing as eternal life in heaven, I am unworthy of it, and it's only through God's grace that I can enter into something like that. 3. God being good would want people such as myself to enter into such eternal life specified into, and there would need to be some sort of reconciliation. The historical background of Jesus and Christianity tackles this problem head on. We are sinners in need of a Savior, and on Christianity, there is hope for us because God has provided a way and has revealed that way to His creation. So the teachings of Christianity mesh in very well with various theological beliefs I'd have even if I weren't a Christian. I allude to a combination of the theological and historical data in the video, like here, that distinguishes Jesus' resurrection from the flying man.
so I've read about, evidence for the resurrection a long time ago. I'm sort of going rusty memory, but I would follow similarly. One is the theological reason that if Christianity isn't true, something very much like it is true. And so that ups the plausibility quite a bit for me. That would not be the case for the flying man.
Largely because I wasn't prepared to debate the resurrection, I was somewhat clumsy in my delivery. Like I said, I was more prepared to discuss the moral argument.
Well, as I mentioned before, a lot of it was theological reasons. Like if I weren't a Christian, I would believe something very much like Christianity.
Maverick, you have to stop because we talked about theology, and then I said, well, okay, why would you think this theology is true? You went back to historical. We're flip-flopping. Do you see that?
At first, I wasn't sure whether you got this idea. I specifically said I'd accept certain theological beliefs even if I weren't a Christian. And in case it's not clear, this means I would accept the theological beliefs without believing in the Bible. I still believe in God. I'd still believe in sin and so forth. Looking back on it now, though, I have an idea.
So what would be your number one reason, theologically, to think that God would desire to raise Jesus from the dead?
It would be the kind of historical background information.
But we just talked about the historical background stuff, and you kind of said, I got theological reasons.
And here was a mistake on my part. The question is about why Jesus specifically rose from the dead. And to explain the theological reason, I had to talk about the historical data about why this specific person, Jesus, rose from the dead. I didn't communicate myself very well here, and so from PineCreek's perspective, it probably looked as if I We're shifting from theological to historical, even though I explain the theological reasons apart from the historical data elsewhere in this live stream. Those theological reasons, again, being that if I weren't a Christian, I'd still believe in God, that I'm a sinner, and so forth. It is the theological reasons in conjunction with historical data that I thought offered justification for why Jesus in particular rose from the dead.
You admitted earlier that you could be a deist.
Yeah, if I were a deist,
Would there
I
still
would
be
believe-
sin?
Yeah, of course.
Really?
Here I could have cleared up his confusion better. Thing is, even if I weren't a Christian, I still believe God grounds morality and that there are moral prohibitions that he's imposed upon us, so of course on this view, there would be sin in the sense of transgressions against the divine law.
Didn't realize you could be a deist and still believe in sin.
I mean, a sin, it's just like a transgression against divine law, right?
But a deist, nebulous God doesn't have a divine law. He just created the universe and that's it. That type of God is what I'm talking about.
Oh, I suppose it depends on how you define deist. I always understood deism to be God created the universe and took a largely hands-off approach. None of the religions are true. But he can still punish people in the afterlife.
Well, now you're importing theology into deism. But we're getting all over the place now.
But yeah, that's part of why, because of that theological background, I believe, even if I weren't a Christian, I would believe in God, I would believe in sin, I would believe there's this sort of problem for reconciliation. And so something like Christianity fits in very naturally to that. Elephant Philosophy, I think, has a video that puts it a lot better than I'm doing it here. I didn't really compare.
Here's the Elephant Philosophy video I was referring to. I'll leave a link in the description below. His philosophical views aren't identical to mine on this topic, but we do share notable similarities.
So to be sure, I think denying the resurrection is rationally defensible. I would put on my atheist hat if I were being devil's advocate. I would argue it much along the same lines you do. One of the reasons why I don't go all the way you do is because I still had that theological background about God and sin and all that meshes
which
in
you
very
got
naturally
from the
with
text.
Christianity.
I don't understand where he got that from. I never said or implied that he got from the Christian text. Maybe it's just something he assumed to be true. Part 5, Conclusion. While my pet peeves of irrationality are straw men and red herrings, and they fortunately existed in PineCreek's critique in some ways that might not be immediately noticeable to some of his more casual viewers, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do this vlog episode on it. Red herrings that argue for a point closely related to the actual topic can be particularly insidious. PineCreek's livestream illustrates that even severe factual misrepresentations need not be deliberate. I've seen people accuse atheist content creators of being dishonest, and I suspect many of my fellow theists aren't sufficiently employing Hanlon's razor because, again, atheists can be amazingly irrational. They can be just as irrational as a religious fanatic, to the point of effectively hallucinating what someone didn't say. As for coming on the livestream myself, I don't think I did that great of a job defending the resurrection in a debate-like setting, largely because I wasn't prepared for it. So I didn't explain myself very eloquently, though I think I did a relatively decent job defending the moral argument. It's one of my favorite arguments in apologetics. PineCreek basically bit the bullet and believed that premise 2 is probably false when I don't think it's reasonable to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. So, by my lights of denying premise 2 is where you have to go to defend your belief system, rejecting the belief system might be the rational thing to do. If I were to debate and my opponent on the debating stage denied premise 2 to save their belief, I probably think I'd won the debate, at least on that particular topic. So, that'll about wrap it up. This is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.